The autumn morning mist hung low over Windsor Castle as guard lieutenant. Samuel Harrison adjusted his red tunic for the third time in 10 minutes. At 28 years old, he had served in the Queen's Guard for 6 years, but today felt different. Today, the world-renowned pianist, Maestro Victor Kozlov, would be performing a private concert for distinguished guests in the castle's music room, and Samuel would be stationed directly outside the ornate doors during the entire performance. Samuel's fingers moved unconsciously in practiced patterns against his ceremonial rifle, a habit he had developed to help manage his anxiety in crowded or noisy situations. What others didn't know, what he had carefully hidden throughout his military career, was that Samuel had been profoundly deaf since birth. He had learned to read lips with extraordinary precision, developed an almost supernatural ability to sense vibrations through his feet and hands, and had become a master at reading body language and facial expressions that revealed far more than most people realized they were. Communicating his deafness had never hindered his performance as a guard. In fact, it often enhanced his observational skills. While other guards might be distracted by conversations or background noise, Samuel's complete focus was always on visual cues, suspicious movements, unusual behavior patterns, or potential security threats that others might miss while processing auditory information. His commanding officers had never questioned his abilities, and his fellow guards respected his dedication and attention to detail. The irony of today's assignment wasn't lost on Samuel. He would be standing guard during what was being described as one of the most important musical performances in the castle's recent history. Maestro Kozlov, a Russian virtuoso in his early 50s, had agreed to perform a private concert featuring rarely heard compositions by Rachmaninoff and Tchaikovsky. The guest list included members of parliament, foreign diplomats, wealthy philanthropists, and several prominent musicians who had traveled from across Europe to witness Kozlov's legendary technique. Samuel had researched the maestro extensively after learning of his assignment. Victor Kozlov was considered one of the greatest living pianists, known for his technical brilliance and emotional depth. Critics described his performances as transcendent experiences that could move audiences to tears or inspire them to heights of artistic appreciation they had never imagined possible. His recordings had sold millions of copies worldwide, and his concerts routinely sold out within minutes of tickets becoming available. What Samuel found most fascinating about Kozlov was the pianist's reputation for perfectionism and his sometimes difficult personality. Stories circulated about his demanding nature, his intolerance for mistakes, and his tendency to criticize other musicians harshly. Some journalists had described him as arrogant and condescending, particularly toward younger or less accomplished performers. However, his musical genius was undeniable, and his ability to interpret classical compositions was considered unmatched in the contemporary classical world. The castle's music room had been prepared meticulously for today's performance. A magnificent Steinway concert grand piano, transported specially from London for the occasion, dominated the space. The instrument had been tuned 3 times by different experts to ensure absolute perfect pitch. Lighting had been adjusted to create the ideal atmosphere, and seating arrangements had been configured to provide optimal acoustics for every guest. Samuel's position would be directly outside the music room doors, which would remain slightly ajar during the performance to allow him to monitor both the interior and the corridor. He had walked through the space multiple times, familiarizing himself with sightlines, potential entry points, and emergency procedures. His responsibility was to ensure the security and privacy of the performance while remaining as unobtrusive as possible. The morning briefing had emphasized the importance of today's event for diplomatic relations and cultural exchange. The performance was part of a broader initiative to strengthen ties between Britain and several Eastern European nations, and the presence of various ambassadors and cultural attaches made security particularly crucial. Any disruption or security breach could have international implications beyond the immediate embarrassment. Samuel's fellow guards had been joking about his assignment, suggesting he was lucky to get what they assumed would be an easy duty listening to beautiful music. He had smiled and nodded at their comments, not correcting their assumption that he would be able to hear the performance. The truth was something he had shared with no one in his military career, a secret that required constant vigilance and careful management to maintain. His deafness had shaped his entire approach to life in military service. He had learned to arrive early for every assignment, to study situations more thoroughly than his peers, and to develop backup strategies for communication when light reading became impossible. He had become an expert at reading written instructions quickly and remembering details with exceptional accuracy. His reputation for reliability and thoroughness had earned him some of the most prestigious guard assignments available. The guests began arriving at mid-morning, their expensive cars pulling up to the castle entrance in a steady stream. Samuel watched from his preliminary position as elegantly dressed men and women made their way through security checkpoints and into the castle's grand reception areas. Many were speaking in multiple languages: French, German, Russian, Italian, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that reflected the international significance of the event. Maestro Kozlov's arrival was unmistakably dramatic. The pianist emerged from a black limousine wearing an impeccably tailored dark suit and carrying a leather portfolio that presumably contained his sheet music. Even from a distance, Samuel could sense the man's commanding presence and the way other guests seemed to defer to him. Kozlov moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the center of attention and the focus of admiration. As Samuel took his final position outside the music room, he reflected on the strange twist of fate that had placed him a deaf man. As guardian of one of the most important musical performances in the castle's recent history, he couldn't hear the conversations happening around him. But he could see the excitement and anticipation in people's faces as they prepared to witness something they clearly expected to be extraordinary. The performance was scheduled to begin at precisely 2 p.m., and Samuel's duty would continue until the final guest had departed. He had no way of knowing that this day would challenge everything he thought he understood about music, communication, and his own limitations. The encounter that awaited him with Maestro Kozlov would test not only his professional abilities, but his personal strength and dignity, in ways he could never have anticipated. The pre-performance reception was in full swing when Samuel noticed the first signs of tension. From his position near the music room entrance, he could observe the gathering through the partially open doors of the adjacent reception hall. Maestro Kozlov stood at the center of a small crowd, gesticulating expressively as he spoke to what appeared to be other musicians and music critics. Samuel's lip-reading skills allowed him to catch fragments of the conversation, and what he observed made him uncomfortable. Kozlov was holding court, his animated expressions and dismissive gestures suggesting he was criticizing something or someone with considerable passion. Samuel watched as the maestro's face contorted with what appeared to be disdain while discussing contemporary classical music and younger performers. Several times Kozlov made gestures that Samuel recognized as universally condescending: rolled eyes, dismissive waves, and exaggerated facial expressions that conveyed contempt for whatever topic he was addressing. The pianist's behavior toward the castle staff was particularly troubling. Samuel observed as Kozlov snapped his fingers imperiously at servers carrying refreshments, pointed aggressively when directing them to adjust the lighting in the music room, and made obvious displays of impatience when his requests weren't fulfilled with the speed he expected. His treatment of a young page who was helping arrange his sheet music was especially harsh, with Kozlov making sharp gestures and facial expressions that clearly conveyed anger over some minor mistake. Samuel had encountered difficult personalities during his guard duties before, but there was something particularly unpleasant about watching Kozlov's behavior. The maestro seemed to take pleasure in demonstrating his superiority over others, using his celebrity status and musical reputation as weapons to intimidate and belittle those around him. The contrast between his public acclaim and his private conduct was stark and disturbing. The other guests seemed torn between admiration for Kozlov's musical abilities and discomfort with his personality. Samuel could see diplomatic smiles and polite nods that didn't reach people's eyes, suggesting they were tolerating the pianist's behavior out of respect for his artistic achievements rather than genuine appreciation for him as a person. Several guests exchanged meaningful glances when Kozlov's back was turned, their expressions conveying shared frustration with his conduct. As 2 p.m. approached, guests began moving toward the music room for the performance. As Samuel took his final position directly outside the ornate doors, which would remain slightly ajar to allow him to monitor both the performance space and the corridor. His role was to ensure complete privacy and security, while remaining as invisible as possible to avoid disrupting the artistic experience. The music room was magnificent, with high ceilings decorated with elaborate moldings, crystal chandeliers that cast warm light across the space, and walls lined with portraits of historical figures. The Steinway piano dominated the center of the room, its polished black surface reflecting the ambient lighting like a mirror. Approximately 40 guests were seated in carefully arranged chairs that had been positioned to optimize acoustics and sightlines. Maestro Kozlov entered the performance space with theatrical flair, his movements calculated to command attention and establish his dominance over the room. He approached the piano bench with the confident stride of someone who had performed in the world's most prestigious concert halls and commanded audiences of thousands. His pre-performance ritual included adjusting the bench height, testing the pedals, and running his fingers silently across the keys to familiarize himself with the instrument's touch. From his position outside the door, Samuel had an excellent view of the entire scene. He could see every guest's face, monitor the pianist's behavior, and observe any unusual activity in the corridor. What he couldn't do, of course, was hear the music that was about to begin. This limitation had never bothered him during previous assignments, but today he found himself curious about what the guests were expecting to experience. The performance began with what Samuel assumed was a Rachmaninoff piece. Based on his research and the program notes he had reviewed earlier, Kozlov's physical performance was as dramatic as his personality. His body swayed with emotional intensity. His face displayed a range of expressions from tender concentration to passionate fervor, and his hands moved across the keyboard with fluid precision that was mesmerizing. To watch even without hearing the accompanying sound, Samuel found himself drawn into the visual spectacle of the performance despite his inability to hear the music. Kozlov's physical expression was so compelling that Samuel felt he could almost sense the emotional content of the compositions through the pianist's body language alone. The maestro's face revealed moments of delicate beauty, dramatic tension, and triumphant resolution that suggested the music was taking listeners on a complex emotional journey. The audience's reaction was equally fascinating to observe. Samuel could see faces displaying deep concentration, emotional engagement, and obvious appreciation for what they were hearing. Several guests had closed their eyes completely, apparently lost in the musical experience. Others leaned forward in their chairs, unwilling to miss any nuance of the performance. A few were visibly moved to tears by whatever they were experiencing. During a pause between pieces, Samuel noticed something unexpected. Kozlov was staring directly at him through the partially open door, his expression shifting from artistic concentration to obvious irritation. The pianist's eyes narrowed as he took in Samuel's position in apparent attention to the performance. For a moment, their gazes locked. Samuel saw something unpleasant in the maestro's expression, a mixture of suspicion and contempt that seemed entirely inappropriate for the circumstances. Kozlov's stare lingered long enough to make Samuel uncomfortable, but he maintained his professional composure and continued monitoring the room and corridor as required by his duties. The pianist eventually returned his attention to the keyboard, but Samuel sensed that something had shifted in the dynamic between them. He couldn't understand why his presence would provoke such a reaction, since he was simply fulfilling his assigned security responsibilities. The second piece began with what appeared to be even greater intensity than the first. Kozlov's performance became more theatrical, his movements more exaggerated, and his facial expressions more dramatic. Samuel wondered if the pianist was responding to the positive audience reaction by amplifying his performance style, or if there was something about the music itself that demanded such passionate interpretation. Samuel's attention was divided between monitoring security concerns and observing the fascinating dynamics playing out in the performance space. The combination of Kozlov's commanding stage presence, the audience's rapt attention, and the elegant setting created a tableau that was compelling even without the auditory component that everyone else was experiencing. As the performance continued, Samuel began to notice subtle changes in some guests' expressions. While most remained deeply engaged with the music, a few seemed to be glancing in his direction with what appeared to be concern or curiosity. He wondered if his presence was becoming a distraction, or if there was something about his behavior that was drawing unwanted attention to his position. The realization that he might be inadvertently disrupting the performance made Samuel more self-conscious about his movements and positioning. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain invisible during guard duties, but today felt different. The combination of Kozlov's hostile stare and the guests' occasional glances suggested that his presence was being noticed in ways that could become problematic. The confrontation began during the intermission between the second and third pieces of Kozlov's performance. Samuel watched as the maestro rose from the piano bench with obvious agitation. His face flushed with what appeared to be anger rather than the exertion of performing. Instead of acknowledging the audience's enthusiastic applause, Kozlov strode directly toward the music room doors where Samuel was stationed. "You there?" Guard Kozlov said loudly enough that his voice carried throughout the music room and into the corridor. Samuel could read the pianist's lips clearly as he continued. "Your constant movement and obvious boredom are disrupting my performance. Do you have any idea who I am or what you're witnessing here?" Samuel felt his stomach drop as he realized the entire audience was now focused on this unexpected confrontation. 40 distinguished guests, including diplomats and cultural officials, were witnessing what appeared to be a public dressing down of a Queen's Guard by an internationally famous musician. The situation was precisely the kind of diplomatic incident that his security briefing had warned him to avoid at all costs. "I apologize if my presence has been disruptive." Sir Samuel replied carefully, maintaining his professional composure while his mind raced through possible responses. "I'm simply fulfilling my assigned security duties as instructed by my commanding officers." Kozlov's expression grew even more contemptuous as he stepped closer to Samuel. Invading the personal space that military protocol typically protected. "Security duties?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've been fidgeting and looking around like a bored child throughout my entire performance. It's obvious you have no appreciation for what you're hearing. No understanding of the artistic achievement taking place in front of you." The accusation stung particularly because it contained an element of truth that Kozlov couldn't possibly have understood. Samuel had been moving slightly more than usual, partly due to his reliance on feeling vibrations through his feet to sense the performance's rhythm and intensity. His visual scanning of the room and corridor was indeed more active than a typical guard might exhibit, but it stemmed from his need to rely entirely on visual cues rather than auditory information. "I have great respect for classical music and artistic achievement," Sir Samuel responded, choosing his words carefully to avoid escalating the situation further. "My attention to the room and surroundings is part of my professional responsibilities, not a reflection of my appreciation for your performance." Several guests began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly embarrassed by the public confrontation unfolding before them. Samuel could see diplomatic faces expressing concern about the scene they were witnessing. The British cultural attaché looked particularly distressed, undoubtedly worried about the potential impact on international relations and the evening's carefully planned diplomatic objectives. Kozlov seemed emboldened by Samuel's respectful response, apparently interpreting it as weakness or deference that invited further attack. "Respect?" He laughed harshly, the sound carrying clearly through the music room. "You wouldn't recognize artistic genius if it struck you in the face. Look at you, a simple soldier, pretending to understand culture and refinement. You probably think military marches represent the pinnacle of musical achievement." The insult was delivered with such venom that several audience members audibly gasped. Samuel felt his face flush with anger, but his military training kicked in automatically. He had endured much worse during his service career, and he wouldn't allow personal embarrassment to compromise his professional duties or create an international incident. "I'm here to ensure your safety and privacy during this performance," Sir Samuel replied with careful dignity. "If my presence is genuinely disruptive, I can request that another guard be assigned to this position." My only concern is fulfilling my duties appropriately. Your duties? Kozlov's voice rose to a level that was clearly audible throughout the castle corridor, attracting the attention of other staff members and security personnel. Your duty should be to recognize when you're in the presence of greatness and show appropriate reverence. Instead, you stand there like a deaf mute, completely oblivious to the transcendent art being created mere feet from your vacant stare. The phrase, deaf mute, hit Samuel like a physical blow. The cruel accuracy of Kozlov's unknowing insult was almost unbearable. But what made it worse was the pianist's obvious intention to humiliate and degrade him in front of witnesses. Samuel had spent years carefully managing his disability to avoid exactly this kind of situation. And now his worst fears were being realized in the most public way possible. The audience was now completely focused on the confrontation rather than the anticipated musical performance. Several guests looked mortified by Kozlov's behavior, while others appeared fascinated by the drama unfolding before them. The British officials present were clearly calculating the potential damage to diplomatic relationships and cultural exchange. Program Samuel's commanding officer, Major Catherine Reynolds, appeared at the end of the corridor, having been alerted by other staff about the disturbance. Her face showed immediate concern as she assessed the situation and realized that one of her guards was being publicly berated by the unnamed featured performer. She approached cautiously, clearly trying to determine the best way to resolve the crisis without escalating it further. Perhaps we should continue this conversation privately, Major Reynolds suggested diplomatically as she reached the music room entrance. I'm sure we can resolve any concerns about security arrangements without disrupting the performance further. Kozlov turned his attention to the major with the same contemptuous expression he had directed at Samuel. Your guard has been an intolerable distraction throughout my performance, he declared loudly. He clearly has no understanding of classical music and no respect for artistic achievement. I demand that he be removed from this position immediately. Guard Harrison is one of our most experienced and professional soldiers. Major Reynolds replied firmly but diplomatically. If there are specific concerns about security arrangements, we can certainly discuss adjustments. However, I can assure you that he has been fulfilling his duties appropriately. The public nature of the confrontation is making resolution increasingly difficult. With 40 witnesses watching every exchange, neither side could afford to appear weak or conciliatory without losing face. Samuel found himself at the center of a diplomatic crisis that threatened to overshadow the entire cultural event and damage international relationships. Samuel made a decision that surprised everyone present, including himself. Maestro Kozlov, he said clearly, his voice carrying the authority and confidence that 6 years of military service had developed. You're absolutely right that I haven't been able to fully appreciate your musical performance. But perhaps you've made some incorrect assumptions about the reasons for that limitation. The boldness of Samuel's response clearly surprised Kozlov, who had expected continued deference and apology. The pianist's eyebrows raised as he prepared what was obviously intended to be a crushing final response to this unexpected challenge from a mere security guard. Assumptions? Kozlov sneered, his theatrical training evident in the way he projected his voice and gestures for maximum dramatic impact. The only assumption I'm making is that you have the intellectual capacity to recognize artistic brilliance when it's presented to you. Apparently, even that assumption was too generous. The cruelty and public nature of the humiliation finally pushed Samuel beyond his usual careful restraint. 6 years of hiding his disability, managing his career around his limitations, and enduring the constant stress of potential discovery had led to this moment of complete exposure and degradation. Something inside him snapped, but instead of anger, he felt a strange sense of liberation. You're right, Maestro, Samuel said with unexpected calm that seemed to surprise everyone present, including himself. I haven't been able to appreciate your performance in the way that you intended, and I think it's time I explained why. He paused, taking a deep breath that felt like the first honest breath he had taken in years. I have been profoundly deaf since birth. I cannot hear a single note of your music, no matter how brilliantly you play it. The silence that followed Samuel's revelation was absolute and crushing. 40 distinguished guests sat frozen in their chairs, their faces displaying a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and dawning understanding of the terrible mistake they had just witnessed. Major Reynolds' expression shifted from diplomatic concern to protective fury as she realized what had been happening to one of her soldiers. Even the castle staff members who had gathered in the corridor stood motionless. Processing the implications of what they had just heard, Kozlov's face underwent a dramatic transformation as the reality of his behavior began to sink in. The confident sneer that had dominated his expression throughout the confrontation slowly faded, replaced by what appeared to be confusion and growing horror. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words emerged. For perhaps the first time in his celebrated career, the world's renowned maestro found himself completely speechless. "I have served in the Queen's Guard for 6 years," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I have protected members of the royal family, foreign dignitaries, and distinguished guests like yourselves through my ability to observe, analyze, and respond to visual cues that others might miss. My deafness has never compromised my ability to perform my duties effectively, because I have learned to excel at the skills that matter most in my profession." The audience remained completely silent, but Samuel could see their faces reflecting a complex mixture of emotions. Several guests appeared deeply moved by his dignity in the face of such cruel treatment. Others looked angry at having witnessed such unnecessary humiliation. A few seemed to be fighting back tears as they understood the full scope of what had transpired. "You criticized my movement and visual attention during your performance," Samuel went on, addressing Kozlov directly. "Those behaviors that you interpreted as boredom or disrespect were actually my attempts to experience your music in the only way available to me. I was feeling 4 vibrations through the floor, watching your physical expression for emotional cues, and observing the audience's reactions to understand what I was missing." Major Reynolds stepped closer to Samuel, her face showing protective pride in her soldier's courage and dignity. She had known Samuel for 3 years and had always been impressed by his dedication and reliability, but she had never suspected the extraordinary effort and skill that his service had required. Her respect for his achievements was now matched by fury at the treatment he had endured. "In fact," Samuel continued, his voice carrying a quiet strength that commanded complete attention, "I have always been fascinated by music, even though I experience it differently than most people. I've studied classical composers extensively because I wanted to understand the art form that brings so much beauty into other people's lives. I can read musical notation, I understand compositional structure, and I know the emotional stories that great pieces are meant to tell." Kozlov finally found his voice, but it came out as a whisper that barely carried beyond the first row of guests. "I didn't know," he stammered, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. "I had no idea that you were ... deaf." Samuel supplied the word that Kozlov couldn't seem to pronounce. "Yes, I am deaf. But I am not stupid, uncultured, or incapable of appreciating beauty. I simply experience it through different senses than you do. Your assumption that my inability to hear your music made me inferior or unworthy of respect says more about your character than mine." The rebuke was delivered,
without anger or bitterness,
but its impact was devastating. Several guests were now openly crying as they witnessed Samuel's grace under pressure and understood the profound injustice of what had occurred. The diplomat from the Russian embassy looked particularly distressed, clearly recognizing that his countryman's behavior had created an international incident that would have lasting consequences. "I owe you an apology," Kozlov said, his voice barely audible and his face showing genuine distress. "I made terrible assumptions and treated you with inexcusable cruelty. I don't know how to make this right. The apology is appreciated," Samuel replied with dignity that impressed everyone present. "But the damage extends beyond just me. You've embarrassed your hosts, created discomfort for your audience, and turned what should have been a celebration of music into a demonstration of prejudice and cruelty. These distinguished guests didn't come here to witness someone being humiliated." The truth of Samuel's words was evident in the faces around the room. What had been anticipation and cultural appreciation had been transformed into embarrassment and moral discomfort. The evening's carefully planned diplomatic and cultural objectives had been completely derailed by one man's arrogance and lack of basic human decency. Major Reynolds finally spoke, her voice carrying the authority of her rank and the protective anger of a commanding officer defending her soldier. Maestro Kozlov Guard Harrison is one of the finest soldiers I have ever had the privilege to command. His service record is exemplary, his dedication is unquestionable, and his ability to overcome challenges that would defeat most people is inspiring. Your behavior toward him has been completely unacceptable. The Major's words carried additional weight because of her own reputation and the respect she commanded among both military and civilian officials. Her defense of Samuel sent a clear message about the values and standards expected of everyone present. Regardless of their fame or achievements in other fields, Samuel made another unexpected decision that would transform the entire remainder of the evening. "Maestro Kozlov," he said, "you mentioned earlier that I wouldn't recognize artistic genius if it struck me in the face. You may be right about my limitations. But I'd like to offer you a different perspective on music and communication." The suggestion clearly confused Kozlov, who was still struggling to process the revelation about Samuel's deafness and his own cruel behavior. "I don't understand what you mean," he said hesitantly. "I mean," Samuel replied with a slight smile that transformed his entire bearing, "that there are ways to share music that don't require hearing. If you're genuinely interested in understanding how someone like me experiences the beauty you create, I'd like to show you something that might surprise you." The offer was so unexpected and generous that it left Kozlov speechless once again. The audience leaned forward in their chairs, intrigued by this dramatic shift in the evening's trajectory. Major Reynolds looked both proud and curious about what her soldier might be planning to demonstrate. Samuel walked toward the magnificent Steinway piano that dominated the center of the room, his movements confident and purposeful. The audience watched in fascination as he approached the instrument that had been the centerpiece of Kozlov's earlier performance. His hands moved over the keys without pressing them, his face showing the same focused concentration that had characterized his security duties. "Music," Samuel said, turning to address the room while standing beside the piano, "is about much more than sound. It's about rhythm, structure, emotion, and communication. Someone who cannot hear can still understand these elements through other senses and through intellectual appreciation of the art form." The transformation in the room's atmosphere was palpable as guests realized they were about to witness something unprecedented and potentially extraordinary. The evening that had begun as a standard classical performance and evolved into an ugly confrontation was now evolving into something entirely different and possibly profound. Samuel looked at Kozlov's extended hand and then at the faces of the 40 distinguished guests who had witnessed this extraordinary evening's transformation. The request to play together represented more than just a musical collaboration. It was an opportunity for redemption, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, a demonstration that art could bridge even the deepest divisions between people. "I would be honored." "Maestro," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "But I should warn you that playing with someone who cannot hear requires adjustments that you may find challenging. We would need to communicate through visual cues and physical connection to the instrument." Kozlov nodded eagerly, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility and curiosity. "Please, teach me how to make this work. I want to learn from you the way you learned from your teacher that music is about more than just sound." Samuel moved to the treble end of the piano bench, leaving space for Kozlov at the bass end. The arrangement would allow both men to access the full keyboard while remaining close enough to sense each other's movements and timing. Samuel placed his hand lightly on Kozlov's shoulder, gesture that would allow him to feel the maestro's breathing and subtle body movements. That would indicate tempo and emotional phrasing. "We'll play Bach's Invention." "No, one in C major," Samuel suggested. "It's a piece that requires precise coordination between both hands, and the mathematical structure makes it ideal for someone who experiences music through pattern and vibration rather than sound. You take the main melody line, and I'll handle the counterpoint." The audience watched in fascination as the two pianists positioned themselves at the instrument. The sight of the world-renowned maestro taking direction from the guard he had so cruelly mocked just an hour earlier was profound and moving. Several diplomatic guests recognized that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Samuel counted off the beginning with subtle nods, and they began to play together. The initial measures were tentative, as both men adjusted to this unusual collaboration. But gradually their playing became more synchronized and confident. Samuel's ability to sense Kozlov's movements through their physical connection to the piano bench allowed him to match the maestro's tempo and phrasing with remarkable precision. The batch invention unfolded with mathematical precision and growing emotional depth as both pianists found their rhythm together. Kozlov's technique remained flawless, but his approach had become more thoughtful and less theatrical, influenced by Samuel's understated but deeply felt interpretation. The music that emerged was a true collaboration, neither man dominating, both contributing their unique strengths to create something beautiful. As they played, Samuel could feel Kozlov's gradually increasing confidence in their partnership. The maestro's initial uncertainty gave way to wonder as he experienced music making in an entirely new way, not as a solo performance designed to showcase individual brilliance, but as a genuine collaboration requiring sensitivity, communication, and mutual respect. The audience was completely captivated by this unprecedented musical partnership. Many had never seen anything like it. Two men from completely different backgrounds and circumstances. One world-famous and one unknown. One hearing and one deaf. Creating beautiful music together through patience, adaptation, and mutual understanding when the batch invention concluded. The applause was immediate and overwhelming. But more importantly, Samuel could see in Kozlov's face that something fundamental had changed. The maestro's expression showed not just appreciation for Samuel's skill, but genuine understanding of how narrow and prejudiced his earlier assumptions had been. "That was extraordinary," Kozlov said softly, his voice filled with wonder and humility. "I have performed with orchestras, chamber groups, and soloists around the world, but I have never experienced music making quite like that. You taught me something tonight that no conservatory professor ever could." Samuel smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression he had worn all day. "Music is a conversation, maestro. It doesn't matter if one person speaks a different language or uses different methods to communicate. What matters is the willingness to listen, or in my case, to feel and observe, and to respond with respect and openness." Major Reynolds approached the piano, her face showing immense pride in her soldier's character and abilities. "Guard Harrison," she said formally, though her voice carried warmth and admiration. "Your conduct tonight has been exemplary. You have honored your uniform, your service, and yourself." The major then turned to address the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have witnessed tonight goes far beyond a musical performance. We have seen the power of understanding to overcome prejudice, the importance of looking beyond our assumptions about others, and the extraordinary capabilities that people possess even when facing challenges that might defeat others." Several guests approached Samuel and Kozlov as the formal portion of the evening concluded. The Russian ambassador, clearly emotional, shook both men's hands and spoke quietly about the lesson in humanity they had provided. The British cultural attaché expressed gratitude that what could have been a diplomatic disaster had instead become a profound example of reconciliation and mutual respect. Dr. Elena Rostova, a music professor from Cambridge who had been among the invited guests, approached Samuel with particular interest. "I teach piano pedagogy," she explained, "and what you demonstrated tonight challenges everything I thought I knew about music education and the relationship between hearing and musical understanding. Would you be willing to speak to my students about your experiences and methods?" The invitation surprised Samuel, but he found himself intrigued by the possibility of sharing what he had learned with others. "I would be honored, Dr. Rostova, if my experiences can help other people understand that limitations don't have to define possibilities, then I think my teacher would be very proud." Kozlov, who had been listening to these exchanges, made an unexpected announcement. "I would like to make a proposal," he said, addressing the room but looking directly at Samuel. "I am scheduled to perform a concert at Royal Albert Hall next month. I would be deeply honored if Guard Harrison would consider joining me as a guest performer for one piece. I believe our collaboration tonight demonstrates something important about music and humanity that deserves a larger audience." The offer stunned everyone present, including Samuel. The idea of performing at one of the world's most prestigious concert venues was beyond anything he had ever imagined. "Maestro, I appreciate the invitation more than I can express, but I'm not a professional musician. I'm a soldier whose hobby happens to be piano." "You are a musician," Kozlov replied firmly. "Your technical skill is excellent. Your musical understanding is profound. Your ability to communicate through music despite extraordinary challenges is inspirational. More importantly, you have taught me that true artistry is about much more than technical perfection or public acclaim. It's about authenticity, courage, and the ability to connect with others through beauty." Major Reynolds looked at Samuel with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal encouragement. "The decision is yours, Harrison. The Army would certainly grant you leave for such an opportunity. I believe your story deserves to be shared with a wider audience." Samuel considered the offer carefully. 6 hours ago, his greatest fear had been that his deafness would be discovered and compromise his military career. Now he was being invited to share that same disability as a source of inspiration and education for thousands of people. The transformation seemed impossible, yet here he stood, surrounded by distinguished guests who had witnessed his worst fear become his greatest triumph. "I accept your invitation, Maestro," Samuel said finally. "But I have one condition. I want to dedicate the performance to my piano teacher, Mrs. Margaret Henley, who passed away 3 years ago. She believed that music belonged to everyone, regardless of their limitations. And she never let me use my deafness as an excuse to dream smaller dreams." Kozlov nodded immediately. "It would be an honor to help you pay tribute to someone who clearly understood music's true purpose better than most professional musicians." As the evening concluded and guests began to depart, many stopped to speak with Samuel personally. Their comments reflected how profoundly the evening had affected them, not just the musical performances, but the demonstration of character, dignity, and grace under pressure that Samuel had provided. The last guest to leave was an elderly gentleman who had remained quiet throughout most of the evening. He approached Samuel with tears in his eyes and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Young man, I have attended concerts and cultural events for 60 years. I have heard the world's greatest musicians and witnessed countless performances. But what you did tonight, the courage you showed, the dignity you maintained, and the grace you extended to someone who treated you cruelly, that was the most beautiful music I have ever experienced." 3 weeks later, Samuel stood on the stage of Royal Albert Hall, looking out at an audience of 5,000 people who had come to hear Maestro Kozlov's concert. The program listed their duet as Invention No. 1 in C major, A Conversation in Music by J.S. Bach, performed by Victor Kozlov and Samuel Harrison. The performance was flawless, but more importantly, it was meaningful. The audience could sense the genuine partnership between the two men, the mutual respect that had grown from their difficult beginning, and the profound truth that music transcends all barriers when approached with openness and humility. Samuel never left his position with the Queen's Guard, but he became a regular guest lecturer at music schools and universities, sharing his story and challenging assumptions about disability, achievement, and the true nature of artistic expression. His message was always simple. Limitations are often just invitations to discover different paths to the same beautiful destinations. Maestro Kozlov, for his part, became a different kind of performer and teacher. The arrogance and cruelty that had once characterized his interactions with others were replaced by genuine humility and curiosity about other people's experiences and perspectives. He often spoke about the night a deaf guard taught him how to truly listen to music. The story of their encounter became legend in both military and musical circles, a testament to the power of dignity in the face of cruelty, the importance of looking beyond assumptions, and the extraordinary things that become possible when people choose understanding over prejudice. And in Windsor Castle's music room, where it all began, staff members still tell visitors about the evening when two men from different worlds discovered that music, like respect and human decency, is a universal language that everyone can learn to speak.